Okay, I've been remiss. There've been sort of at least three recordings that I've been meaning to make that I've been doing other things. I guess I'm going to focus on politics and talk a little bit about morality. Or I guess this will be a bit of a mishmash of two of those recordings. The South African situation is still pretty dire. I mean, I don't follow politics incredibly uh, closely, as it were, because it's so depressing, and also because it upsets me slightly that when I do hear things that the DA is doing, in terms of the comments that the DA makes about certain issues, and I mean, perhaps they're making more comments that just aren't getting through because journalism is so sort of full of activists and has such a kind of ideological bias that you can't. They're not going to report on actual jugular attacks on their ideology, which they protect and decontextualize reality in order to support. Um, but the kind of polemic that I've been wanting the DA to make is very straightforward. Um, that if you look at Tito Mbowene's remarks during his budget speech when he talks about Tygerberg Hospital, maybe that's a joke, maybe that's not a joke, maybe maybe he was sort of trying to be funny, or something like that, or maybe he was being serious. I mean, I don't know which one is. I guess if he was being more serious, that is more egregious. If he actually thought that what he said was true. Um, I'm not sure which one is worse, if it's actually if it's a joke or if it's serious. But if you also look at some ANC, again, I don't follow politics, so I can't. But there was an incident with the Brackenfell um, parents and the EFF protesters, and the president sort of supporting the protesters or supporting the right to protest, um, and always making these very judicious remarks, being sensitive to the kind of, the black fascist political sentiments. And then when you see the police chief sitting next to the EFF, and then the spokesperson gives quite a measured response that tries to sort of hit all the right tones, and then in terms of debate or questioning afterwards, says, oh well, obviously the EFF members and the ANC, or government appointed police minister, they are colleagues in parliament, so it's fine that they sit together. It's this is obviously the wrong signal, and obviously how it was excused away by the ANC spokesperson just shows how facile, how hollow, how superficial their lip service is to non-racialism. You see even the president Ramaphosa mentioning the words non-racialism when he clearly has lost the plot. He doesn't know what non-racialism means. It now means something completely different within the anti-racist uh, sort of political fascistic sentiment, sort of framework, um, which has now essentially become the new normal, and we have essentially hard boiled our democracy, and we're or in the process of now completely charring it, and because we've got the kind of between a rock and a hard place. You know, you almost don't know which one is worse: the ANC normalizing this kind of bullshit, or the EFF that keeps on sort of trawling the line forward. Um, and I mean, it becomes more and more conspicuous that the ANC leans into this kind of racialized politics and racialism because it's a wonderful crutch to their policy failures and political unaccountability. Yeah, I think that there just needs to be essentially some kind of imputation of the EFF as being the shock troopers and being the stormtroopers of the ANC. That needs to that view needs to start being raised as a polemic from the DA's side. That the story must not be that the EFF are acting egregiously. The story must be that the ANC is not responding, and that their lack of response and their lack of responsibility is egregious. That is actually the proximate problem that we have in the country is not the EFF, it's the ANC who has this puppet essentially, or has this convenient, because essentially it's the politics of the EFF which are essentially um, how the ANC gets to uh, consolidate its political weaknesses and recycle them as ideological virtues. Um, and I mean, I think Tito Mboweni, in some sense, he has gifted the DA part of one of the puzzle pieces of building that polemic, and in some sense, it's as important as you make it important. It's as um, you know, it's as relevant and pertinent as one draws attention to it. And I think that, I mean, look, I don't know if the DA is making all the right noises on this, and it's just not being reported. But I think there can be some very clear sort of straight talk about uh, the moral degeneration of values. And I mean, you have judges that use the word intersectionality in their judgments. Uh, Things are going pear shaped all over the place, and we have to start being blunt and raising a polemic that uh, the new South Africa has been betrayed by the ANC. This is conspicuous. It has been repudiated. It has been undermined. Um, the moral foundation of the new South Africa has been attacked, and because the moral foundation is actually not just a moral foundation, but it's reasonable, it's ethical, it keeps things above board. Because we have not kept our ethics, we have become susceptible to being cheated and stolen from and undermined, and and the kind of policy that is created that is antithetical to the constitution, which and we've got these weak constitutional judges essentially that don't defend the constitution, don't defend its founding values, because they have ideologically betrayed it. They have ideologically betrayed non-racialism. And that's a very important uh, line that needs to start being pointed at. That um, um, yeah. So let me just think. So I mean, and I did, to me it's so depressing. It's hard to point out, but essentially the damage that the ANC has done is so costly and so high, that we used to have genuine hopefulness about where the country could deliver its people to, where we could end out. And we've just had so many years of betrayal, of theft, of corruption, and there is a special part of this, there's a special place for this to be put on the shoulders of Cyril Ramaphosa. And I mean, perhaps you can say, well, he has to juggle many different things because his own party is such a corrupt institution, is such, and perhaps, the actual, the best thing that Cyril Ramaphosa could have maybe done for the country is if he had actually actively tried to showcase the internal corruption within the ANC and basically to try to explode the party because it's just so beyond redemption. It's so beyond being functional. It's so uh, effectively just a mafia that has no integrity, that cannot generate coherent policy that actually can do anything for the country. Its policy has welded within it, uh, this concentration of state power that can facilitate corruption. That it's just it will always be toxic. It will always, because I read somewhere that corruption is only a third of the problem in this country, and probably what's a bigger obstacle to this country than corruption, and that's saying a lot because corruption is terrible, is policy. It's just the policy is stupid and is made to destroy opportunity. It's made to destroy growth. It's designed almost to strangle a developing country. And there's no and there's a perverse ideological incentive to never scale back uh, um, that kind of interventionism, that kind of heavy-handed, mandated, quota-driven, sort of idea that if anyone gets a job, that's they should just be lucky to have a job, and that'll be the only, and that job needs to pay well because it's the only job that they can ever hope to get. There's no, you know, idea that you get a job and you get more skilled, and that you get another job, and that you market your skills, and that you actually are in a job market that is vibrant and dynamic. It's this kind of like any kind of job is just almost like it's like your socialistic conscription into society, and things must just be, and so the market has no genuine flaw in it. It has only this artificially mandated, government demanded um, criteria which cannot be supported because we don't have the kind of education and productivity that other countries have. Um, and the failings of the education system, are certainly politically also um, contributed to, uh, that need to be tackled. But anyway, I guess this has been sort of all over the place. But I mean, perhaps it sounds a bit too abstract to say, well, the problem with South Africa is that it has betrayed non-racialism, and so it can't actually generate criteria and objective measurements about its own progress. Um, It's very interesting. I mean, I've been looking at the ultra um, policy as made famous now by the Free Market Foundation, um, which was policy or regulation that came out in 1991, which allowed people to essentially convert their tenure and possession of land essentially into a title deed. And the obtuse treatment of that regulation of that policy, which effectively is trying to destroy it at the moment. Uh, its current amendment would literally uh, destroy that process that people can do in order to attain a title deed. Um, it's it's farcical, you know. It's sort of the irony. I mean, just how bad the ANC is actually at fulfilling any of its supposed ideological aims, you know, because it's essentially it's now, because of its leaning into racialism, is completely set on this kind of racialistic parasitism, on this kind of vampire state, um, which is also what, you know, sort of anti-racism is all about. It's this very strange uh, toxic moral creature that has a fake morality, really, which is a kind of naked form of racism that is just dressed up in fancy words and made up constructs, and redefining what ordinary words mean in order to kind of. And then you have the kind of nonsense which Tito Mbowe. I mean, I would like to think that he was joking, because that's the only thing that kind of makes sense. But if he wasn't joking, I mean, it just shows you just how far the rot has spread. That people who are ostensibly intelligent can just make such asinine and stupid remarks, and think that there's some kind of oh, well, because a hospital had a structure built within it, that now the structure cannot be used in modern South Africa. You have to demolish it and you have to build a new hospital. I mean, like, surely this is nonsense. I mean, this is almost the crux of essentially the strange moral retardation which gets sort of injected into everything, that you have to kind of make these weird symbolic concessions on behalf of groups of people in order to promote the right kind of racial consciousness, to promote people's racial pride, while uh, giving another set of people a kind of group shame, or racial demotion or something like that. I mean, it's really surreal. It's really strange. It's really you know, it's so racially obsessed. Anyway, there's no point in me talking about these things in this kind of unnovel way. But anyway, I wanted to talk about art and why art is failing so badly. But this is a cultural commentary, and it's a bit of a tangent to what I was just talking about. But anyway, I guess I'll just continue and make this a single recording. Is that the reason why art is failing so badly at the moment, why comedy doesn't work, and why narrative and plots and writing, and why the quality of writing in series and things like that um, is at such a low, specifically in projects where there is the sensitivity to this woke anti-racism ideology. Um, is because they don't have an ethical system that functions. They have a superficial ethic. So they have to achieve certain moral outcomes that symbolize certain moral pictures. And essentially, the only way that you can achieve that is by essentially having some kind of emotional parasitism, where the bad guys have to kind of be tormented or tortured or something like that. You know, it's sort of, it's very strange because essentially they have undermined the concept of righteousness, that there is no such thing as righteousness. You see, within anti-racism is essentially a kind of pluralistic moral authority. Their moralism cannot actually lead to a unitary common notion of righteousness. So if you have a kind of a pluralistic form of justice, because everyone can subjectively look at it from their own sort of intersectional point of view, um, the only way to know if the good guys have won in the end, or the only way to have an ending that is sort of contextualized or outlined by in any kind of moral sense, is by the superficial outcome, because there's no sort of meta narrative as to the single reference of a single definition of righteousness or moral authority, because moral authority is now pluralized. There are as many moral authorities as there are identities. And so essentially, I mean, it's the curse of having a non-normative moral schema. When you don't have normative values anymore, instead you have a moral picture, the plot has to be uh, choreographed in a way in which there is no meta-analysis that can be applied other than essentially duplicating or validating the ideological formula, the ideological narrative, which, because essentially you don't have normative values, instead you have a moral picture, which then you can liken things to. And so you have to replicate the same moral picture. And so all of their plots are disgustingly uh, derivative. There's like only one movie you can make. And I call this, so I think that as movies go, it's almost passes as art. It almost reaches the level. I mean, there's nothing technically wrong with this movie other than its underlying message is disgusting, vacuous filth. Because it's essentially it's Nazi propaganda. It is the propaganda for fascist culture, and it conceptualizes people and narrative in the same way that the Nazis thought about themselves. I mean, the Nazis would have called themselves social justice warriors. Why not? I mean, they called themselves socialists. They used everything that had a positive connotation; it belonged to them, and everything that had a negative connotation belonged to their enemies. I mean, it's just like the EFF. There's no difference. But the movie that I'm talking about is called Valerian, the City of a Thousand Planets. Uh, and this movie is essentially, I mean, if you follow the plot of that movie, the aliens that were cheated out of their planet because other people were conducting a war close to it, and this environmentally destroy their planet, and then they're kind of refugees, and then they just want to retrieve some lost aspects of their way of life, because then they can use that to kind of go back to their way of life, using their amazing, intelligent use of technology, because these people are so magical that they were in a kind of state of nature when they were being destroyed, but they very quickly sort of became technological wizards in their refugee status, because they're just sort of they're so natively strong. They just have so much uh, implicit virtue and worth, that they are like naturally superior, although they're not naturally, let's say, prone to the same kind of defects that would lead to destroying innocent bystanders, as they were the innocent bystanders that were destroyed by these evil humans, essentially. Um, and so, it's basically it's the story that Hitler would have told about the Aryan people before World War II. It's the same story. Uh, you understand that essentially these people were so pure, um, and they just want to go back to being left alone, essentially. And what's stopping them from doing that is essentially other people who have stolen their heritage and stolen what belonged to them originally in the first place. So, Valerian, the City of a Thousand Planets. This is about the best sort of I mean, you can only do this in science fiction because it gives you a time scale, it gives you a plot that is that sort of, kind of, on the level of a kind of geopolitical, you know, because you can, distinguish between these different species and things like that. It's all nicely tied up in a bow, and you can do that in sci-fi once. You can't do that over and over again, um, without it looking more conspicuously like overt fascism, which is what anti-racism eventually leads to. And so it's interesting that what is being you see I, what is also so vacuous about this movie is that the moral value that is being fought for in this movie is a sympathy given from one species to another species, because it's a weird kind of sympathy. It's not a joining of interest. It's really just the exchange of sympathy between one people and another people. There's no empathy there. It's just, oh, I feel sorry for you, and I feel bad maybe because I have a racial. I'm part of the human race, and the human race essentially led to the destruction of your world. So I maybe inherit some guilt, and I feel sympathy for where you've ended up. It's there's no depth, there's no common purpose, there's no. It's interesting that there's no very clear cut sort of collaboration between the protagonists in the film, um, and these people who demand our sympathy, and that really facilitates the ideology in the film to a very great extent. Because if there was overt collaboration, it would be very hard to get that right within the script, and for it to pay homage and to hit the ideological target that it would have to hit. I mean, this is the problem that identity politics has when you try to manifest it, when you try to bring it into the workplace, for instance, is that what you eventually have to do is you have to make sure that everyone believes that they're on the same page, which is not really possible to do because we don't natively hear each other's thoughts. We can't mind read each other, and because you can always project intentionality onto anyone else for not validating your beliefs, this means that people are like at least ideologically, potentially risky to one another. So the best way to allow people to imagine that everyone believes the same thing is to segregate them, is to say, well, we believe the same thing, and we don't want to even let you think that we don't believe the same thing. So it's better if we don't uh, inhabit the same spaces. And you can see this, that when they give this kind of training now, they have people of color seminars, and then they have where they segregate all parts of interaction, to minimize the kind of really the impossible standards of compatriotism which is demanded within this ideology, which is really sad, because the people who believe this ideology are not being benefited from this supposed support and agreement with their belief. It just it produces more toxic self-esteem, essentially, because they don't access the self-esteem. Their identity gets the self-esteem, but they are not their identity. Uh, and so then their identity has to become more of a performative feature of their beingness. And it just gets more and more toxic. It gets more and more projective. They have to sort of have this magical thinking and this cognitive dissonance, and they have to be able to participate in scapegoating and witch hunts and things like that in order to believe that they are getting something from their identity, which they're not. And eventually, the only thing that you can even get for your identity is the idea that somebody else's identity has been taken down a peg, so that relativistically speaking, your identity must be stronger. And so, you have to not see anyone who is doing any better than what is regarded as, I guess, the median within your identity, or something like that. You have to measure it in that kind of parasitism. Um, and that's essentially what it eventually leads to. And I mean, I've said this in other recordings in much more eloquent ways, but this is because there are no positive values. There are only negative values. There's a definition of what is unjust, but there's no positive definition of what is just. And because the negative values, or the morality which is founded in negative claims, operate as blanket accusations, and then you have to somehow not not be prone to those blanket accusations. So you have to be non-complicit. You have to prove somehow that the blanket accusation does not apply to you. And this will always involve some level of hypocrisy. And so, as hypocrisy is part and parcel of the anti-racism sort of ideology, it has this internal toxic snowball effect, or whatever, is that you have to become more radically responsive to codes of conduct and dicta, and just superficial formulations of what should be said or done, and how to judge if people fall foul of some metric. And so you kind of, in some way, the only way that you can protect yourself is by being part of the mob that is part of a scapegoat, or part of scapegoating or witch hunting what is essentially its own hypocrisy, its own double standards, which are uh, you cannot uh, avoid the accumulation of these double standards. And in some sense, that makes it even more dangerous to start thinking about anything, sort of rationally or fairly or with any kind of common sense. You end up having to keep yourself secluded in this moral narrative, in this moral paradigm where you just have a moral picture and the ends justify the means. And so it's anyway. I mean, this is why their ideology is so prone to being able to concoct, sort of highfalutin sounding terminology, because you know you can construct the formula out of a different arrays of component constituent parts, um, and then if you just kind of make it sound formal and you make it sound important and you make it sound like, well, it's been uh, rigorously sort of mapped out that somehow these treads are well worn, and these gears and mechanisms are essentially the components of how um, sociology or morality are supposed to be an abidance to. Anyway, I mean, I just wanted to point out that essentially, if you want to produce entertainment, if you want to produce things that uplift the soul, perhaps, or that educate, or that do many nice things at the same time, one of the core components of this is being able to play off something that, let's say, naturally breaks the fourth wall. That you have the moral ethos in the themes of the plot that you are watching, and you have the moral ethos in the audience. And when you have a cultural consensus, when you have a strong culture that has an anchor, a common anchor in values, in that maybe we don't agree on the same facts, but we roughly have the same moral standard, we roughly have the same moral target, or something like that. Or even if that's a bit fuzzy but it's disagreed on, but we still believe that there is a target to be hit, and that it's something that can be debated and arrived at, that's something that we can negotiate towards. But you see, that isn't possible if you are an anti-racist, because then you believe that you can't understand somebody else's lived experience. It's not accessible to you, because there's this kind of this weird sort of false consciousness that is attached, and that is part of identity. And this is an unfalsifiable hypothesis. This is an unfalsifiable racist sentiment and theory. And as soon as you let that in, you've just made it impossible uh, to have that common anchor point that breaks the fourth wall, that can actually make writing magical. Because then you can actually, through your writing, you're learning something about the soul. You're learning something about righteousness, about what righteousness is in itself. But the anti-racist people can only say, this is what righteousness looks like. This is how it's defined to look in this context of this plot. There's nothing ephemeral. There's nothing transcendental. There's no fourth point of common intersection. There's no common intersection that breaks the fourth wall. Um, that that has the ability to at least conceptually transcend time, and because it's supposed to be timeless. Essentially, you're talking. This is why it was. Well, I mean, the movies, I guess, were called the silver screen. Um, anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but now, without that, you have demeaned and disintegrated the dignity of the individual because you have removed from them the outlook. Uh, you have demoralized uh, the reach of their morality. You have said that their moral consciousness uh, is prone to a kind of contrived pluralistic theory that traps it into being defective. And so and it leaves you with nothing. It leaves you with, in some sense, a kind of, well, here are the instructions because as a group you've done something to some other group and believe in whatever historical mythology or mythos or whatever that comes along with that kind of political infantilism, in some sense, that your morality can't know what's going on, so just fall in line with the narrative, fall in line with the formula. And here's a plot in which people are essentially the meta message in the plot now is about the vying between these identities. It's almost like everything that you're watching now is almost like a kind of I mean, if only it was as good as this, because the analogy that I'm about to give is actually, it's nowhere near like this, because it's much worse than this. But it's, imagine you had like the Greek pantheon, the Greek gods having drama with each other and fighting with each other. But then imagine that it's not just all the different Greek gods embodying these different themes, but it's just one Greek god replicated 12 times fighting himself in different identity with different labels. That is essentially how we have corrupted media. And it's unwatchable. It's pathetic. Um, and it's interesting because you can't just even fix this by making in the old style. The only way to bring it back is to have a reconvened cultural consensus around morality, around kicking out this disgusting half breed. We really need to see a kind of, in art perhaps, a polemic of kicking out a rotten, toxic ideology, and sort of seeing how people get over. I mean, I don't know why there hasn't been a movie about some man in his very early 20s, or perhaps very late teens, in college or university, and some woman at this college and university, and just having shitty relationships, just having shitty discussions, just having an egregious existence, and people having ideological fights with one another about this bullshit, just just to try to get some clarity as to I mean, I didn't watch it, but I know that there was sort of a Netflix series, or I think it was Netflix, that was like Dear White People. You need to have a series like that, but sort of in the reverse. A series that is almost, I mean, like, I didn't watch the series, so I mean, I don't know, but I would say that is almost the same plot, but just actually shows some actual ideological fight back. That actually it puts this bullshit on a pedestal, and then it actually has a real thorough dressing down of it, um, and showing the kind of toxicity of the people that are the adherents and proponents of this bullshit. Because I mean, these are people who are essentially, I mean, they are embodiments of the devouring mother as an archetype. You know, they are hybridized, borderline personality disordered, sort of fascistic simpletons. These people would have been called useful idiots by Hitler, because they spread the fascistic conception of society, and they conceptualize everything exactly like fascists do. Uh, in some sense, they're a bit worse because they have to kind of make it sound intellectual, whereas a fascist would believe the same thing, but then just kind of dumb it down slightly, or just kind of say, well, I don't have to research it, because everyone's on the same page. But I guess you have to kind of make it more intellectual when you have a kind of a rainbow Hitler sort of version of how society should be governed. But essentially, fascists just know that it's impractical, that you're not going to be able to govern a state using the morality of identity. If you have to serve more than one identity, it's not possible. You can only State power can only serve one identity. So essentially, fascists just have that one extra belief tacked on, essentially, um, which is something which is already practically pretty much understood within the anti-racism crowd. They generally, if they're at all serious about wanting to stop the systemic oppression, what they are clearly asking for is the establishment of some kind of, essentially, some kind of pseudo ethno Balkanization. You know, these people are disgusting. And this is essentially because we have not been able to criticize what needs to be criticized. In some sense, I think that what has precipitated a lot of this anti racism is that culture was not more precise at making people feel responsible for, among other things, their bad outcomes, and showing them how they use their toxic culture, how they lean into their toxic subculture, and they use it as a crutch in order to create a kind of collective excuse. Well, I'm part of this toxic culture, and I can't stop being a part of it. So if it brings me down, it's not my fault that my culture became toxic. I can't leave it, which is not true. Um, if you talk to anyone who's sort of bettered their life, they will tell you that they had to leave behind the mentality that they were surrounded by, essentially, and aim at something consciously, and create the culture that they wanted to inhabit in some sense. Uh, and I do think that in a lot of ways, people are held back by their toxic culture, and we do need to criticize culture more, um, which is effectively what used to be happening in movies like Tropic Thunder, in movies that put racial stereotypes on display in the best light possible, in the best way of doing that sort of thing. Because it was not like, let's say, the American and Indian stereotypes in cowboy movies. It was not like that. It was not done in that kind of non conscious way. In Tropic Thunder, it was done consciously. And what's ironic is, the director of that movie, I believe, now completely repudiates that kind of humor. It's funny. So he obviously thought that it was a good idea at some point, that it was okay. Now it's problematic, and he openly renounces his own work. So it's interesting that I guess he had a lot of I don't know all the fancy words that they use. Um, uh, Internalized uh, white supremacy. I guess that's what they would label it now. So it's internalized white supremacy to say that cultures are going to lead to different outcomes, because some cultures are literally dysfunctional, or at least have different trade-offs. At the very least, you have to say that cultures are capable of having different trade-offs. But some subcultures are downright toxic. Uh, and the reason is because the types of people who are empowered by that culture are the worst people. They are these devouring mother types, to use the archetypal. They lean into their borderline personality disorder, and they've created a cultural edifice to sort of promote what I would consider to be a kind of hybridized borderline personality disorder, where their self-image that is inculcated within this culture is maintained as a very stringent convention, sort of set of cultural conventions, which then can be conveniently deployed as needed in order to secure what I would generally call a form of narcissistic supply, which, as narcissists will know, is a curse, because you're addicted to narcissistic supply, but you never enjoy it, and so it never ends. It's a voracious, um, and so these are the kinds of psychopathologies that we have running around in our society, and I would almost say that it has broken out from a toxic subculture to now become the cultural hegemon, which is very dangerous, because you cannot. I mean, I used to describe this talking about the mafia. The mafia always feels sorry for itself. They always have the sob story. Oh, we didn't want to sell protection to people, but we first came as immigrants and they wouldn't let us into the business sector. So we just had to get guns and hold up people at gunpoint and sell protection to them, because there was nothing else for us to do. We just had to become complete criminals. So that they have this kind of, oh well, we were hard done by, and so this is why now this is the only way that we can make ends meet. And then that becomes the mythological sort of basis of an underground. But you see, that kind of underground can't exist without a stable way of doing things that it can parasitically draw from. And when the culture at large becomes that model of underground parasitism, it doesn't work, because it needs to be the kind of the dysfunctional siphoning of productive energy from something that at least in concept has a positive value system that can kind of conserve itself to some degree. But when your main sort of cultural hegemon is this destabilizing sort of I'm losing the game, so I'm going to flip the chessboard over, or whatever, um, or the checkers board over. That essentially there's nothing. Uh, there's no structure that then can support anything. Uh, and so we do have a cultural problem. And anyway, I should say now, back to the politics, that we have to take this cultural problem politically head on. And if we don't start getting political leaders that do take these cultural issues of toxicity head on, um, we're not going to have a functioning system. And one of the symptoms of this, which we already sit with, is that we don't have media anymore. We can't watch plots. We can't watch narratives. It doesn't work because the magic is lost. Because you're not being spoken to like a person. You're being spoken to as an identity. It's disgusting. It's racist. It's bigoted. It's prejudiced. And we get told that this form of bigotry is good for public morality and it's good somehow for victims, and there's some kind of hysterical moral panic that some activist journalist is pushing, and it's so disgusting, the kinds of the accusations of cultural appropriation and things like that. It's so blithely racist, and the pageantry of it as well. I mean, it's just, these are people that are morally the scum of the earth. They have uh, they need to be. We need to get people to condemn them, to show them out. To morally challenge their. If we don't get this polemic going, we're going to get slow cooked. The state itself is going to become more institutionally corrupt and toxic, which it already has, at least in the South African context. It's disgusting. And obviously, this is very convenient for plutocrats. This is very convenient for people who, um, you know, and again, I'm just trying to say this is a moral crisis which has political ramifications, which has governmental state ramifications, and it is a. I think we should perhaps call it a mega crisis. It's not one thing, but in some, I think the broadest umbrella of what it is morality. It is a crisis in morality. Um, I need to tack on this extra bit of recording, because it's an important aspect. Is that, like, not only is the morality of the moral picture and the ends justify the means, not only is that model so vacuous and superficial and hollow, but and not only does it require scapegoating, is that the thing that it is essentially scapegoating is normative morality, is actually having ethical principles and standards that are canonical, that are normative, that everyone commonly holds. That needs to be seen as the perpetrator. That is the thing that is absorbing most of the blanket accusation. And so the thing that's actually being vilified within the anti-racist woke ideology is the very thing that has the only chance of actually doing anything, at actually fixing any problems. So they end up sort of delivering to themselves their own self-fueling doom prophecy, essentially, that the more corruption, the more political catering that they have over policy and things like that. I mean, this in the South African context, the policy is so. It, it's it's almost laughable and ironic how people talk about the Great Reset, and if you just kind of look at what that style of governmental oversight is, South Africa is almost a modern case of a political elite that has tried to engineer something like a Great Reset on racialist lines, instead of intelligently developing a country, instead of actually having an actual plan and having political accountability for the outcome of their policy. They never are to blame for their failures. Somehow it's because, oh, there's more hidden systemic racism that's holding everything back, because their plans are so without without the ability to do anything. That somehow the racism inherent in the system is always, and so, when they attack the thing that would actually give you stable metrics that you would actually measure if you were making progress or not. um, it's interesting because in some sense it's more like attacking your critics rather than attacking the problem and actually overcoming the challenge. um, and vilifying your critics as somehow being the thing that's preventing you from achieving your stated aims. It's a weird kind of projection that gets put onto things. But anyway, I thought that little catch is quite important. Essentially, how in some meta sense they've almost doubled down in the best way possible, because they are essentially saying the reason why we're not arriving at the utopia, or the reason why our policies don't seem to work, is because people haven't fully given themselves over to the racialist consciousness. They haven't fully allowed themselves to be owned and possessed by their identity. Why, and they haven't. They're not organizing themselves under the uh, representation of identity Führers, essentially. That if everyone would just play their role according to the formulaic sort of collective guilt, then everything could sort of be mandated from the moral narrative from the top down. Um, which, everything gets conflated into this weird moral narrative, and so it has no real handle on how anything actually functions or works. It's But anyway, I just thought that I would. So I mean, it really is toxic. It really is so incredibly corrosive. Um, and as culture has made room for this, politics, I think, has become more and more unwieldy, more and more surreal, more and more poisonous. But yeah, I mean, I guess I was exploring this from the level of media and entertainment and just writing and narrative, and just how basically how hollow art is, because now art is just a kind of is a perspective within this identitarian drama, which, you might think makes you a kind of a more sophisticated denizen of this, of essentially this kind of fascistic power tug of war that's constantly going on in the background, and that will somehow need to be quelled by having a kind of a Führer arbitrating and saving and infantilizing everyone's identity and brokering some kind of arbitration and mediation that is imposed from the top down. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess what has been most damaging is just that this art, because we no longer inhabit the same moral space as each other, because we are, according to anti-racism, we're all locked into this kind of false consciousness of our identitarian persuasion that is just implicitly part of our socially constructed experience, or whatever mumbo jumbo that they're going to use to describe it. Um, which is essentially, I mean, it's in it's completely, there's no difference between that and the way that the fascists conceptualized their mythological history and sense of self within a collective mythology, within a collective narrative of their people. And but what's almost worse is that in the anti-racist intellectual translation of much the same ideological functioning, the thing that binds them together is the systemic oppression, is the blanket accusation. So it's almost more bloodthirsty than the fascist one, because at least the fascist one can have a cold war and kind of have political stability. Whereas I would say that what Hitler would have called useful idiots, or these proto-fascists, these identitarian social justice warrior proto-fascists, what they are in fact is they actually need to have a kind of constant agitation. They need. I mean, well, I mean, it's somewhat arguable because I mean the fascists also had to ritualistically have, you know, sort of their book burnings, and they had to ritualistically, um, you know, the propaganda had these weird sort of hyper realistic cycles, trumping people up into a kind of frenzy. Um, it's much the same as when you see these liberal, progressive, left wing people, you know, being hysterically radicalized by the media and by whatever the current sort of uh, activist journalism, you know, sort of issue is that's built up because, uh, yeah. So I mean, you know, the kind of the hyperrealism of Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany. I would say that's what we're experiencing, and but I mean, I'm trying to also explain most of the stuff as to why art itself is devoid of meaning because it doesn't speak to a a universal point anymore. It only speaks to what the universal moral paradigm has been partitioned and balkanized into, which is essentially these identitarian sects. And so you are consuming media not as a human. You're doing it as an identity. And in some sense, therefore, the message of the narrative, the theme of the plot, um, does not speak to the audience in one tone. And so, you know, you're getting this very brittle, mixed message constantly because it has to send two messages constantly, in some sense. Unless you have a way in which the plot can directly sort of set up the Hitler wet dream, you know, plot of Valerian, the City of a Thousand Planets. Unless you can do Valerian, the City of a Thousand Planets every time you have a narrative, you can't you don't have the space essentially. So you to give that kind of complete narrative overview from the whole plot, you have to be constantly sending out two messages to your audience, where essentially people who are representative of the systemic oppression and people who are representative of the sacred victim or something like that. Uh, you're sending out these dichotomous, you know, sort of moral judgments of signaling to people how they should be sorted according to this narrative, which is, you know, has this kind of immediate hysterical moral panic, sort of that it's always trying to communicate, you know, that you have to be part of the witch hunt. I mean, I mean, we we really need a kind of a morality renaissance, and we need to have a cultural movement that tries to create some kind of constitution that tries to define and defend non-racialism, and that institutions and things, businesses can say, "Oh no, we stand behind that kind of moral declaration." Because without that clarity, you cannot you cannot uh, you cannot resolve disputes without creating more toxic identity consciousness. You can't even have functioning institutions without that kind of those moral values. Because if someone is going to represent symbolic power of their whole identity, and they can and they can raise that card and they can play that card whenever they so choose to, you're not dealing with an individual human being. You're dealing with someone. I mean, this is why it's always so unattractive, and it's always so pathetic when you're dealing with these people who latch themselves onto the Black Lives Matter movement as if their experience has to do with the color of their skin and not them as individuals. How do they make that connection, that it isn't perhaps a defect with their character, and not that you're going to redirect perhaps feedback that you're not taking in as a human being because somehow there's nothing wrong with you. You're just a generic identity, identity. It's really grotesque. The kind of the almost the blatant self uh, deluded, sort of and sort of semi-grandiose power that one is channeling, in this weird kind of self-pitying resentment that one is saying, oh no, the problem here is that we have a political problem. We don't have a personal problem. We don't have an individual problem. Or there isn't, and what's even more disgusting is that the idea is that you're going to shame and extract sympathy from people in order to mend this fence, or something like that, or to create a solution to this problem. And it's by compelling people according to some kind of political, it's so, it's ironic that essentially some kind of identity false consciousness is built into supposedly, the critical race theory stuff, when that's exactly what they perpetrate in an egregiously directed way, and that they propagate, that they are allowed to cultivate a kind of a personal false consciousness, because it's part of the solution, inverted commas. Their pain, their hurt feelings are that are attached to this identitarian racialist consciousness is somehow part of the solution. And it's I mean, it is to a large extent to sacrifice the internal locus of control to lean into a very cheap and convenient and easy external locus of control that gives you a narrative that explains everything, just merely at the cost of putting labels and projecting things onto other people. Um, but and if you give yourself the luxury to do that, if you give yourself the leeway in order to do that, I mean, you can understand why these are the kinds of people. I mean, I've described them in personality style terms. The beta quadra type of people, the intuitive feelers, as it were. Also, I guess the SJs have some component of their quadra using MBTI sort of as an approximation, but there's actually probably a better grouping that I could come up with some of the four sides of the mind terminology, but I'd have to go look at it. Informative control types. I think either one of those categories, informative or control types, both of them, I think, would have these kinds of toxic but sort of personalities that I mean that I would say that they have implicitly in their personality style, they have this kind of toxic potential about them but that it kind of gets crystallized when it's reinforced by a kind of ideology or with a kind of cultural structure or some kind of belief system or something like that. If you have a kind of a belief system that reinforces it, and in the same way, it can be ameliorated by having, let's say, an enlightened belief system, then it can kind of keep the toxicity, can keep a lid on it. But anyway, the informative and control types um, will, I think, if they are given this tool of being able to liberally project onto people labels in order to give themselves access to convenient and neat narrative explanations as to what's going on, that gives them a nice external locus of control, which then they can kind of um, model their control after, or feel that they can tap into plotting and tracking things based on how they can see themselves in that kind of model. But well, I mean, basically the problem is that you end up with sort of irrational dogma that becomes a kind of tautology, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and essentially it's all hedged on you having a very concrete view that you can read other people's minds. Um, and you're able to sort of reflexively judge other people. But I was just trying to say that the disgusting thing in terms of how becomes a self fulfilling prophecy is the fact that these types of personalities, when they have that kind of ideological narrative, or when they have that kind of explanatory power in their head as an external locus of control, that they have a solipsistic link to being able to project onto people and to privately know what's going on, these people are repulsive. I mean, like on almost on a spiritual level, they are suffocating. Uh, because I don't know if you've ever experienced someone who is informative. Um, it leads to a kind of immaturity because they can speak for you. I mean, because they can just project things on you freely. So it's like they're just waiting for their turn to talk. There's no dialogue, there's no exchange going on. It's just they want their information to be validated, or some shit. Or they want to be in the controlling seat, if it's not an informative, but if it's a controlling sort of personality. Or sorry, not controlling. It's either it's control or responding is the two things, and it's informative or direct. So those are the two dichotomies, at least within four sides of the mind terminology. You get either informative. Oh my word. What did I just say? It's I think, yeah, it's controlling or responding, and it's informative or direct. And so yeah, it's and it just so happens that the section of the population which does happen to be part of control and responding types, these people, culture does matter more to them, because if they have a narrative that you're on the right side of, then there's a kind of, perhaps there's a kinship there or something like that. Uh, but the sad thing is that that's a very brittle way of organizing a society. And it requires having out groups. It requires generally, I would say, having scapegoats. I mean, science scientism and the academy essentially, and it's kind of pseudo intellectualism, and it's kind of, there's so many toxic things. I mean, you can see this theme sort of permeating, the kind of the SJ sort of population of the academy. When I say SJ, I don't mean SJW. I mean sensing and judging in terms of the MBTI sort of. That there are a lot of sensing and judging academics. But anyway, okay. So I mean, if you might not follow the stuff when I'm talking about personality, because I'm talking about what is effectively regarded as a pseudoscience, but it's probably the most popular form of typology, MBTI, Myers-Briggs Personality Type Indicator. And I was just talking about some of drawing some terminology or some jargon, but anyway, um, when I talk about personality, I talk about MBTI most often because it is the most popular and readily known by people that care about typology. Although I have my own sort of different typology, but anyway, like I'll just say, like, for example, I can't even remember what the definition of informative is. I think it's you have to have introverted sensing or introverted thinking in either your dominant or secondary function, or in either your hero or your parent function. Man, it might even be third slot as well. Man, I can't even remember. But and I know that this is going to sound very obtuse because I mean, well, first of all, I don't really agree with MBTI. I think it's an approximation, but it's a decent approximation. I think my models on typology are much more precise and accurate, and actually have. But anyway, my models are also not completely finished, but even in their unfinished state, I would say that they're much more insightful and incisive than MBTI. But anyway, I would link that to TI, and there are a lot more types that have TI in them. But I would say that because SI, you can get SI. It might not even be. The definition of informative might be extroverted intuition or introverted sensing. I'm about to go into a very detailed explanation of why there are certain specific relationships to the cognitive functions have to one another. Um, or I'm going to give well, it's not heretical because it's not even well known, I guess, uh, but my different stance on it based uh, on my modeling and the actual structure of the personality. But I shouldn't talk about it because it's way too tangential. Um, it's not really that important, but basically, I don't agree that functions have axes in the way that was the recent sort of update in MBTI in recent years, that each function has two different axes. That has an axis of, so like NI and NE shares an axis, and NI and SE shares an axis. And so in the same way, introverted sensing and extroverted intuition could both, at least through some chain, could could be characterized as having a common. Yeah, okay, well, I guess I will explain it. Well, I won't give my alternative model of why there's something else that explains how cognitive functions are connected to one another without using axes. But essentially, I think that what is actually being shared between extroverted intuition and introverted sensing that makes someone an informative type if that is even, I believe that I'm half remembering that. You see, I don't pay much attention to it because I don't consider it to be truthful. It's like a useful approximation that I name drop just so that people get what I'm saying. But I think that let's say, the common relationship between those two things is introverted um, thinking, because introverted sensing will be linked to extroverted intuition. Um, Wait, none of those things get anywhere close to introverted thinking. I know, so I can't even do it through using the approximation of axes. But anyway, that doesn't upset me because I don't agree with axes anyway. But damn, I thought there was something. Yeah, I'm trying to remember something that I said to somebody else one time. But anyway, never mind. Uh, that's just embarrassing, I guess, for me. But anyway, horribly useless tangent, almost to begin with. Anyway, this was going to reinforce the general rant that I have against introverted thinking, and how introverted thinking essentially establishes cults. Because just because something is self consistent doesn't mean that it is correct. So just because something has been sort of given the nod by introverted thinking doesn't mean that it is correct. It just means that it's self consistent. And so, for example, just because social justice warrior stuff is self-consistent doesn't mean that it's correct, doesn't mean that it's coherent, doesn't mean that it's rational. um, but they even openly reject these things because they want to live in something that no longer resembles humanism or humanity. They want to be identitarian fascists, essentially. And their moral consideration is rooted in their patronage of the identity, because the identity is the metaphysical uh, repository of status and well-being. And so, sort of, your identity is exalted via you as a vehicle for your identity achieving some kind of status. It's a very strange form of it's almost like an ideological form of narcissism. But I would say that in terms of how, I mean, in the same way that borderline personality disorder can be considered as being a almost like a multiple personality disordered narcissist, which is more complicated than that, because it's not as if each sort of, the the permeability of identity within borderline personality disorder, the transient nature of their identity, um, I would say, is because their narrative and their ability to direct the narrative is essentially their form of narcissistic supply. Um, Being able to incept people in what I call an introjective paradigm, um, which is a bit of a rearrangement of some concepts that I learned from being exposed to Sam Vaknin's work on narcissism. And he also obviously talks about things like borderline personality disorder. But I mean, I I have sharp disagreements as to what's actually going on with borderline personality disorder, because to me it's very clear that this is just a very sophisticated variant of psychopathy. Uh, I mean, it's not secondary psychopathy; it's just a I consider it to be almost a Machiavellian sort of psychopathy, and that is also using the social mask as a anyway. I've got huge recordings about this. I shouldn't be rehashing it now. This is not helpful. But it is interesting how I think that this is effectively. I mean, I think that this is culturally what happened to the USSR. I think this is um, yeah. I mean, in some sense, unless the fascists eventually emerge, I mean, which you can see happening in South Africa, it's more likely to happen in South Africa than I think in anywhere else. But if the black fascists in South Africa rise and eventually reorganize the state around their ideology, it will become more overtly like Nazi Germany. But if the proto fascists, the social justice sort of crowd, if somehow they manage to come up come out on top, which I don't think it's possible because I don't think that they have a coherent way to organize a government. I don't think they have. You cannot be a rainbow Hitler. The state cannot serve more than one identity. But what so I think that they are there to have a half life and to essentially be betrayed and killed by the real fascists or by the full blown fascists rather. But if their proto fascism were to take hold, it would be much the same kind of cognitive dissonance that the USSR had to embody in terms of having the show trials and having this ideological conformity that essentially what happens in practice is so far off what happens in the ideological narrative that somehow that gap is just automatically filled by playing your performative role. But yeah, what really needs to happen is people need to start articulating non racialism very clearly and talking about the betrayal of the new South Africa and talking about the betrayal of the Constitution and how, the failing of us to keep our high moral standards has been what has made us susceptible to this kind of uh, plutocratic corruption and you know just complete abuse of government power. But also, I mean, I just keep on thinking more and more how it might become necessary to, in order to save anything of the new South Africa, is to try to get the Western Cape to declare itself independent of the rest of the country. I don't. I'm starting to think that uh, that might be the only way to sort of to keep the constitution intact, um, and to be an example, I guess. But and maybe reunification might be possible in the future if the rest of the country sort of, maybe that's the kind of blow that South Africa needs, the breakup of the union, in order to precipitate some kind of either. I mean, because either. I mean, at some point, the country is going to be more and more failed. The state is going to become more and more manifestly a failed state. And at least if the whole country doesn't go that way and there was another part of the country that went a different way and was able to actually develop, um, and show an example as to how the rest of the country essentially was torn down um, by a plutocratic elite. but yeah, I mean, the problem is that we don't have any recent history to kind of vindicate the argument because it was never allowed to happen, uh, essentially. And now we've had such an account or such irresponsible governance that has essentially destroyed whatever hope we might have had, and now we just have blatant agitators like Julius Malema, who quite obviously is trying to precipitate a crisis so that he can have some kind of chaos which can hopefully precipitate either a genocide or a coup. That's very clearly what he is trying to edge towards. And yeah, I don't see anything other than a very clearly defined polemic having a chance of countering that. Because I mean, essentially, the rot has already taken root. You know, there really is just so much. And I do feel that there isn't enough. I mean, it might just be that essentially the democratic institutions which you need in order to have a functioning democracy have just been so systematically undermined because of sort of journalism being captured by these kinds of ideological activists, but that also which we kind of inherit as this toxic atmosphere from overseas as well. So you have this kind of this cult of virtue signaling and that kind of pollution in the environment, but that also just practically news outlets are so many of them. Uh, the power of the purse is held by the entrenched powers that have collected. There's no more independent media essentially, and to the extent that there is independent media, it's completely swamped. Um, by this, quite morally vacuous and overtly racist, ironically calling itself anti-racist, sort of proto-fascism, which is a gift to all plutocratic, governments everywhere, to lean into identitarian. But yeah, I mean, I mentioned Tito and Mboweni, and maybe I was being too harsh on him because maybe what he was doing is he was trying to give the DA a gift. Maybe he was trying to say, I'm. He doesn't have that much power uh, as the finance minister, ironically, because his party is so corrupt. At least what he could do is be brazen about the ideological dishonesty by proffering clear, exemplified instances that can be cited, therefore, like the Tigerberg thing. So maybe he's giving the DA ammunition against the ideological line of the ANC. I mean, I really think that it's kind of it's Cyril Ramaphosa. The thing that he said when he commented on the EFF having the right to protest, and talking, which was essentially giving a kind of a half nod, or that maybe there was an issue about the school that needs to be addressed, or something like that. It's that kind of dirty racialist politics that needs to be underlined and needs to be put on the doorstep of the ANC. And this is not good enough. This is not non-racialism. You have betrayed the Constitution, and you're very clearly doing this out of political convenience, because you are and essentially you have abused the new South Africa, but you've also abused people's trust. And now you have a toxic ideology which you have to promote, because otherwise you have no hold on staying in power, essentially, without using this as your crutch. And it's disgusting. Uh, and it puts you in alignment with the EFF, and that's very clear when you look at the police minister, who is, I mean, these are people that, if we do have a genocide in this country, the police minister needs to go to the Nuremberg uh, trial. And I'm saying that because that's where the Nazis were tried after World War II. We're going to have to do something like that, and he should be up there.